Hey CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here. This is your Chapter 8 lecture on photosynthesis, the process where a plant absorbs sun's energy and converts it to food. Let's dig in. First thing that you need to know about photosynthesis, gang, is just a basic definition of the process. So I looked it up in the dictionary. This is what I came up with. It's a series of reactions in which plants convert solar energy into glucose. Wow, that sounds really complicated. Well, let's try to break it down into some simple, easy parts. So basically, sunlight is energy. All the energy needed to support life on Earth basically starts there. That solar energy, as it's called, well, through photosynthesis is converted into a simple sugar. That's what glucose is. It's a simple sugar, or a monosaccharide, which you might remember from our coverage of biomolecules in a previous video. So that's a pretty special thing, and I gotta be honest with you, there's a whole lot of organic chemistry that's needed in order to make that happen. Don't worry, we don't have to go into too much detail right now. I'll just try to give you the bare bones basics. Let's start this way. In order for photosynthesis to occur, there's really some non-negotiables that you have to have. For starters, you have to have light. Light in the form of the visible light spectrum. That's the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Now there is light that's outside of that spectrum, as you'll see and as we'll talk about later, but it's either moving too slowly and useless as a result, or so fast that it's literally dangerous. So you just use the Roy G. Biv visible light spectrum light when it comes to photosynthesis. You gotta have it. Second, you gotta have a way to catch this light. So there's this thing called chlorophyll. It's a photosynthetic pigment. It's kind of like a catcher's mitt, and it catches that solar energy so that we can convert it into something else. You'll also need some other inorganic materials, like you're going to need some water, some nitrogen, some carbon dioxide. Well, that's not inorganic, that's organic, but you got to have carbon dioxide too in order for photosynthesis to happen. Well, this is the equation for photosynthesis. We take carbon dioxide plus water and sunlight and ultimately produce glucose, that simple sugar, and some oxygen. Now this is such an important equation to you. I can't stress it enough. You need to learn it, memorize it, tattoo it to your brain so that you never ever forget it. Not only will it show up on quizzes and tests, but hey, we can't survive without it. No other organism on the surface of the earth other than plants and their relatives can pull this off. And if they don't do this for us, A, we don't have food, and B, we don't have air to breathe. That's kind of a problem. So this is a hugely important chemical equation. CO2 is carbon dioxide plus water, add in a little sunlight, and we yield C6H12O6, that's glucose, and oxygen, the air we breathe. Sounds super complicated. Let's take a look at the parts. There are three basic pieces to this whole idea of solar energy becoming food that we need to deal with or talk about. The light reaction, the dark reaction, and then the actual gas exchange, respiration, carbon dioxide for oxygen. So in terms of the process, if we go deep, the light dependent and light independent reactions are the first two things we want to dig deep with. So the light dependent reactions are the reactions that convert light energy into chemical energy. Now there's a lot of chemistry that goes on there, so I'm just going to tell you, you kind of have to take my word for it. The light that strikes a plant has energy associated with it. That energy is going to be transferred to the chemical bond energy in things like ATP or, well, eventually, simple sugars. The molecules of ATP produced in the light dependent reaction are going to fuel the light independent reaction. Everything requires energy, so if you've got another reaction that's going on in the plant and it's not running off sunlight directly, it needs energy from somewhere. That somewhere in this case is the ATP from the light dependent reaction. There's a couple of things that you got to get here. First is the order in which the reactions have to happen. The light-dependent reaction has to happen before the light-independent reaction because the light-independent reaction requires the energy from the other reaction in order to go, right? So that's super, super important. They're connected to each other in that way through that energy transfer. And the other thing that's important is to look at the conditions in which these occur. The light-dependent reactions, their name tells you, they have to have light to happen. Again, light in the visible light spectrum. The name light-independent reaction tells you that, well, those reactions don't really need light. So the conditions that these occur in are not the same, but they are connected to each other. Let's first dig deep in the light reaction, then we'll talk about more of the reactions that make up the light-independent reactions. The light reaction occurs, if we want to be super picky and super specific, in the thylakoid inside of a chloroplast. So if you want to be really general, you could say, well, it occurs in a leaf, right? So the leaves of plants are where photosynthesis really occurs, or the thylakoid inside the chloroplast. What's a chloroplast, you ask? Well, you should remember those from our cell parts video. It's like a mitochondria. It has its own DNA, its own ribosomes, and it can kind of divide whenever it wants. It's a specialized organelle that in this case doesn't make energy for the cell, but instead makes food. So this is part of a two-step process for a plant that a plant has to go through for survival. That two-step process is making its food, and then the second part would be extracting the energy from the food. We have a two-step process for survival as well. We don't make our food though, we just eat. So photosynthesis is kind of like taking the place of you and I eating. No matter whether we're a plant or an animal, there's still a second step. That's called cell respiration. We'll deal with that in another video. So the chloroplast is a specialized organelle where this food gets made. It has characteristics like a mitochondria, its own DNA, its own ribosomes. It's got a double membrane system to it, and this is where the reactions that convert light energy into food occur. How does that happen? Well, let's begin here. So when a chloroplast is going to quote-unquote catch or harness the light's energy, it can't just, stick its hand out there and grab it. To trap the energy from the sun, a chloroplast uses a pigment called chlorophyll. Those pigments are held in super tiny concentrated spaces inside of the thylakoid membrane called photosystems. Each photosystem has several kinds of pigments in it, but the most common is chlorophyll because, well, basically it absorbs the most light. There is one kind of light that chlorophyll will not absorb, and that kind of light is green light. So if you're ever asked on a test, hey, why are plants green? Well, that's why. Because plants don't absorb green light. Everything that we see in the world around us is really the end result of light striking a surface and bouncing off. So whatever light a plant reflects is what color the plant's going to be. What the plant reflects is dependent upon the pigments that are inside the plant itself. My shirt looks gray right now because it has a pigment in it that, well, for lack of a better way to put it, is absorbing most of the light that hits it. When you absorb almost all or all the light that you are struck with, the pigment or the garment in this case that you're looking at, or maybe a desktop that you're looking at, will appear black. Black, or gray in this case, absorbs light, doesn't reflect much. So if I wear this shirt outside on a sunny day, it's going to make me hot and sweaty because this is going to absorb the sun's rays. The opposite is true of the little eagle head that you see right there that's white. The little eagle head has a pigment in it that is actually reflecting all the light that strikes it. When you reflect all the wavelengths of light, what we see with our eye is white light. That's actually something good to wear when it's hot outside because all that light's going to bounce off of you and you're going to stay nice and cool. To help you kind of understand what chlorophyll is doing, I've got a graph that I'll show you here in just a second called its absorption spectrum. But before we do that, I want you to see where this chlorophyll lives inside of a chloroplast. So this is a very basic picture of a chloroplast that I just sort of drew with some of the editing tools here. There's an outer membrane to a chloroplast. There's an inner membrane to the chloroplast. The outer membrane is kind of like a cell membrane. The inner membrane's folded into these pancakes that we call thylakoids. If you have a stack of thylakoids, we call it a granum. And if you have multiple granum, we use the word grana. Okay? There's kind of a soupy cytoplasm out here, and that cytoplasm is the stroma. So just for the sake of orientation in space, the light reaction occurs here inside the thylakoid. The light independent reaction is going to occur out here in the stroma. Chlorophyll then lives inside the thylakoid where the light reaction occurs. Now, regarding its behavior, remember, chlorophyll absorbs most of the visible light that strikes it, except for greens and yellows. That's why plants are that color. Here's a graph to see what I mean. Across the bottom, you will see the visible light spectrum: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Those are the colors of light that we can see, and you can see chlorophyll absorbs red, orange really well, and it absorbs blue and violet really well. But look at this huge trough in the middle. Like, that's light that is bouncing off of the plant that could be used for photosynthesis, but chlorophyll doesn't like it. It's reflecting it. Now, if you made a living off of absorbing light, like that was how you got all the energy to make your food and survive, is it really a good thing to allow this deep trough to exist, to reflect all that potential energy away and just let it go? You should be shaking your head, no, Mr. Kennedy, that's not a good idea. And for plants, it's not a good idea either. So in a plant, plants have accessory pigments. Accessory pigments are pigments very similar to chlorophyll, and basically they step in and fill that gap. So there's two I would really like you to know. They are the xanthophylls and the carotenoids. Xanthophylls are yellow in color, which means they absorb all light really except for yellow, and carotenoids are kind of a red-orange. So again, they absorb all light except for the red-orange. So if we go back to this graph, if I add xanthophylls and carotenoids, the xanthophylls would be high here with the red-orange, dip at yellow, and then high over here. And the carotenoids would be low here at red, orange, and then high from everywhere else. So the xanthophylls and the carotenoids fill in this gap to the best of our ability. Proof that they exist comes in the seasonal change of leaf color that we see during the fall. Basically right now plants have green leaves. It's summer. But as fall kicks in and the weather gets cooler and the amount of hours of daylight decreases, chlorophyll production slows down. And as chlorophyll goes away, the only thing that's left in a plant's leaf for us to see are these accessory pigments. So a green leaf might turn yellow, it might turn orange or red, and then eventually brown as all pigment production stops and the leaf falls off, the plant goes dormant for the winter. So those are our pigments that make it possible for us to actually capture this solar energy. Let's get into the light-dependent reactions a little bit more deeply. So if we just put to words what's happening in the light-dependent reactions, here's the nuts and bolts of what's going on. Sunlight has to strike chlorophyll. That chlorophyll is packaged into a photosystem inside the thylakoid membrane. The energy from that sunlight is going to be transferred to electrons in chlorophyll. Those electrons, once excited, are going to be picked up by an electron transport chain and passed down that chain through a series of proteins. And as they move through these proteins, well, they're going to lose some energy along the way. So when you think about sunlight striking chlorophyll, I don't know if you've ever seen those little machines that you can put on your desk that have the little silver balls, and you grab one and you let it go, and then the energy goes across and the other one goes, and then the energy goes across like that. That's kind of like what's happening with chlorophyll and light. So the solar energy is like that first ball slamming into the whole row of like 5 other silver balls, and then as the energy transfers through, the one on the end pops off, right? That's what's going on with chlorophyll as light energy strikes one side and electrons shoot off the other. Those highly energized electrons are valuable though. You don't want to just let them go. So at the end of the day, there's an electron transport system to catch them and use their energy for a purpose. That electron transport chain involves a lot of chemistry, so I'm not going to try to teach you every step, every transfer that goes. But what I do want you to know is as we take electrons from one protein and move them to the next and to the next, it's not 100% efficient, so some energy is lost. That's okay though, because that lost energy can be replaced by the next photosystem, and that lost energy can actually be put to work. The lost energy can be used to form ATP from NaDP, or it can be used to pump hydrogen ions into the center of the thylakoid disc, and basically pumping those ions creates a concentration gradient. If you don't remember what that is, go back to our video on diffusion, osmosis, all that, and remember that a concentration gradient occurs anytime you have an unequal distribution of particles on either side of a semi-permeable membrane or a barrier of some sort. So if my face is a membrane, concentration gradient exists like so. Okay, the electrons that move through this electron transport chain build that gradient, or they make ATP. As they've finished this electron transport chain, they're going to end up at a second photosystem, and at that photosystem they're going to be re-energized by more sunlight. Once re-energized, they're going to be passed to yet another electron transport chain, and in that electron transport chain they're going to be passed off to an electron carrier called NADP. NADP stands for, and you don't need to write this down, nicotinamine adenine dinucleotide phosphate. I know, lots of letters. Anyways, you could think of this as almost like a little dump truck that's going to pick up all these powered up electrons and carry them off to the light independent reaction. So NADP picks up these electrons from this second electron transport chain and then moves those to power the light independent reactions in conjunction with the ATP that was also made in the first electron transport chain. Now, before we leave the light dependent reactions, we also have to talk about this. Each chlorophyll, as it's struck by light, will lose electrons. Those electrons have to be replaced. So there is yet another chemical reaction that occurs to help replace those lost electrons, and it's called photolysis. Photolysis basically occurs when water is struck by sunlight in a manner the same way that sunlight strikes the chlorophyll. So water will be split into 1/2 O2 and 2 hydrogen ions as a result of sunlight striking it. Though 2 hydrogen ions become the protons that get pumped in the first electron transport chain of the light dependent reaction. They build the concentration gradient that we talked about. And remember, that concentration gradient is going to be used to make ATP from NADP after the first electron transport chain is done. The oxygen, well, take a deep breath and think what that could be for. Yep, you guessed it. That's the air you're breathing right now. So without the light dependent reaction, without water, not only would we not have food, which is produced through the next reaction series, but we also would not have air to breathe. Pretty cool. I think that's pretty special. Alright. Now, in text, the restoring electrons from photolysis looks like this. The oxygen produced by photolysis is released into the air, supplies the air we breathe. The electrons are returned to chlorophyll, and the hydrogen ions are pumped into the thylakoid where they accumulate in high concentrations to become our concentration gradient. Here's a very, very simplistic picture to help you kind of wrap your brain around everything that we've just talked about. So if you imagine that what you're seeing here is inside the thylakoid membrane, these photosystems are where chlorophyll lives. Sunlight is going to strike those photosystems and cause electrons to get excited and get kicked out of that chlorophyll or photosystem. The electron transport chain will catch those electrons and pass those electrons through a series of proteins that are still embedded in the thylakoid membrane. As they're passed, energy is lost. That's why this line comes down. That lost energy can be used to make ATP here, or remember, it can also be used to make the concentration gradient, right, that we need to make ATP. If we're making a concentration gradient, then those electrons will simply be pumping little H pluses across the thylakoid membrane, right? Hydrogen ions. As those electrons get here to photosystem 1, they will have lost some energy. Photosystem 1 re-energizes them, kicks them up to yet another electron transport chain, and that second chain transfers light energy, right? Or in this case, these electrons to NADPH2. Now, that NADPH2 and ATP are going to power the light-dependent reactions. That's where we're going to go next. Okay? So if we had to just kind of like write down the products of the light reaction, you got to say the light reaction makes ATP and it makes NADPH2. We should probably also add to this list that it releases the oxygen that we breathe. That ATP, NADPH2 goes here. The dark reaction, sometimes called the Calvin cycle, probably more properly termed the light independent reaction. Now remember, this is kind of a misleading name, dark reaction. It gives you the impression that this can only happen at night. That's not true. This can occur anytime, day or night. The word dark reaction implies that basically light's not necessary for this to occur. Why do we call it a Calvin cycle? Because that's the name of the guy that discovered it in 1961. Alright, where does this happen? This occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast, or basically that cytoplasm-like space, right, of the chloroplast. And that fact kind of supports the theory of endosymbiosis, because there's bacteria, free-living bacteria, that do the same kind of reaction in literally the same place, right? So more to come on that when we get to evolution. Remember that the term dark reaction is misleading. Dark reaction is misleading because the reaction can also occur during the day. It can also occur during the day. Light is not necessary for this to happen. Now, if we wanted to just kind of sum up what this looks like, there's a couple of simplistic diagrams that I can show you. This is the first one. The dark reaction, or light-independent reaction, involves carbon dioxide being bound to a molecule called RUDP, ribulose 1,5-diphosphate. That forms an unstable 6-carbon compound that will immediately break apart into two molecules called PGA, right? PGA will then become a simple carbohydrate called pGal. This cycle will go again and again and again and again until eventually a simple sugar, glucose, will be made after several rotations. Another way to look at it is like this from your textbook. So here we have RUBP picking up CO2, forming an unstable 6-carbon molecule that splits apart, right? This is our PGA. ATP, NADPH are added from the light-dependent reactions to get us to pGal, right? That pGal will continue this cycle or perpetuate this cycle, becoming more RUBP. After several rotations, eventually that pGal will become a simple sugar. Now let's look at each reaction very closely at what's occurring. So the first part of the Calvin cycle involves what's called a carbon fixation step. The carbon atom from carbon dioxide bonds with RUBP to form an unstable 6-carbon sugar. That unstable 6-carbon sugar literally immediately falls apart. So you, from that 6-carbon sugar, immediately split into 2 3-carbon molecules. Okay? That 6-carbon molecule does not last very long. Immediately breaks apart. Now we're going to use ATP and NADPH, right, to power the continued movement of this cycle. So ATP and NADPH power a series of reactions, right? That are going to convert the 3 carbon molecules into phosphoglyceraldehyde, or PGAL. PGAL is a 3 carbon sugar that actually does have a pretty decent amount of energy associated with it, but that's not the ultimate end product of this reaction series. We're going to keep this reaction series going for several rotations before that PGAL is released to form glucose. So the sugar production, 1 out of every 6 molecules of PGAL is actually going to be transferred to the cytoplasm and be used to make something like glucose. Now if you do the math, 1 PGAL has 3 carbons, a glucose has 6, so it's going to take like 2 PGALs to make a single 6 carbon glucose at the end of the day, right? After 3 rotations of the Calvin cycle, we can actually produce 6 molecules of PGAL. So mathematically, that means potentially 3 glucose molecules. If we're not producing glucose, well, then that PGAL is going to be used to replenish RUBP and keep this cycle going. All right. So that is the light independent reaction in as simple a manner as I can put it for you, okay? Remember, the goal of the light independent reaction is to eventually produce sugar. That's the sugar, or simple sugar, that the plant needs for food and that we benefit from as we eat plants to get food ourselves, okay? But this is only 1/2 of the process that gives us the energy we need to survive. This takes the sun's energy, converts it to the chemical bond energy in a simple sugar like glucose, but after that we still have to do cellular respiration so that we get the ATP that we need to do everything else required for life. All right, CW Bio. That's the end of your photosynthesis lecture. I'm Mr. Kennedy. Remember, handouts for all of these lectures are available from our class webpage, and you'll always be able to find these videos on Mr. Kennedy's YouTube channel. Okay, see you next time.